All right. Hey, folks, how are you doing? Great. So we had a complicated title of a talk, and I took the liberty to modify it a little bit to make it simpler because we are going to talk science. So I wanted to make it really simple. So in plain English, what we are going to be talking about today is what the hell is science? What the hell is decentralized science, right? So leveraging blockchain for open, collaborative, and efficient science. So to kind of give you a breakdown of the whole landscape and how blockchain is being used for scientific discovery, funding, research, and IP management, first I will tell you a little bit more about challenges in traditional science. And then I will reflect about projects that are building in specific verticals to address the challenges in the whole value chain of scientific discovery, from funding of innovation, later through execution of research, and last but not least, to publishing of the results of the research. Okay, so let's get started. If you guys happen to have any questions in the middle of the talk, just raise your hand, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go. We know that at least I tend to forget questions if I don't put them down or I don't ask them immediately. So let's make it a little bit more collaborative if you want. Cool. So for those of you who don't happen to be scientists, who don't work with science, science, of course, as an old-fashioned traditional industry, is fraught with many challenges. So among those, four that I think are the most important ones are funding bottlenecks. So difficulty in getting your research funded. So you're a talented scientist, you have a novel breakthrough idea. To be able to put together a study, of course, you need funding. And there are many challenges with that because majority of the research is funded through government grants. Second area is publication bias, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples how actually publication bias affects everybody here in the room, even though you don't know it. The third is data accessibility and reproducibility. So I'll show you that the vast majority of research, especially in biomedical sciences, is not replicated. So even though some results are out there, other folks are not able to take the same study with the same design and replicate the same results. Last but not least, there are intellectual property issues. So of course, majority of commercial research is done with hope of inventing something new, of patenting it at the end of the day, and gaining monetary benefit from distribution of that intellectual property, right? So let's zoom into funding bottlenecks. So currently, majority of science, majority of discovery and research is funded by either government grants or private sponsors. There is a significant bias with government funding, at least, towards safe experiments. So something that is not, quite a moonshot, not, that exciting, but it wouldn't make me look a fool if I decide to sponsor it, right? If I grant, if I give away a grant towards that idea. There's also bias towards well-established researchers. So if you are a researcher affiliated with a reputable university with a bunch of publications under your belt, of course, it's much easier for you to get subsequent funding, which once again is a bias towards safer experiments at the peril of more bolder ideas. There is a lot of time and effort connected with obtaining government grants. And of course, there are also neglected and orphan diseases. So for those of you who happen to also be longevity enthusiasts, there's a very good point made by researchers working with longevity that, this area is underfunded. It's not yet a point of interest for major pharmaceutical companies. There's not much commercial innovation coming through the research pipeline. Therefore, it's not funded adequately, and by extension, there cannot be as much innovation as we hope there would be. Let's look at the second one, which is not so easy to understand, yet I think it's the most important one here. So let's look at the publication bias. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some common drugs and the research discovery process behind bringing those drugs to market and using them as medicines that all of us may be taking one day in the future. I'm a medical doctor by training, and most of the drugs here I actually myself prescribed. And I did it because there was peer-reviewed literature and there was scientific consensus that those drugs are good for the patients, right? So for that reason, I was able to infer with certain logic that I can give this drug to the patient and that would be the best treatment option, right? Not always right. So for example, there is a drug called lorcainide, which is an anti-arrhythmic drug. And there was a study done in 1980s where they took a bunch of people, about 100 people, and they divided them into two groups, right? So 50 people got the pill after a heart attack, and 50 people got a sugar pill after a heart attack. Out of the 50 people who got the real drug, 10 of them died. And out of the 50 people who got a fake drug, a placebo, only one person died. So I'm going to ask you, is that a good drug? Not really, right? So for that reason, this drug wasn't patented, wasn't brought on the market, but this research, because it was a negative research, it was, nothing extraordinary. Nobody invented a cure for cancer. It was a negative study. It was a bad drug. Nobody wanted to hear about it. It wasn't published, okay? And for that reason, subsequent drugs, also from the same class, were successfully brought into the market and were used for many, many years, treating myocardial infarction patients, so patients with heart attack. And it's estimated that because of the use of those drugs, about 100,000 people in the US alone died over the period of 15 years. Why? Because that research wasn't published, okay? So we could have known before that these drugs aren't really effective, as a drug to manage patients after a heart attack, but there is a strong bias in publications in research towards positive science, okay? So experiments that actually work, as opposed to experiments that do not. You may think that was, a one-off event, but actually this is emblematic of a much broader phenomenon in science. So let's take another example, reboxetine. This is a drug which is an antidepressant drug. So doctors prescribe it to treat depression and mood disorders. And I actually read the studies that support the evidence for using this drug in patients. So there was one study that compared reboxetine versus placebo, and it found out that reboxetine is better than a sugar pill, okay? And there were 3 studies that compared reboxetine with other antidepressant drugs, and it found out that it's just as good as any other antidepressant drug. Is it a good drug? That's a question for you. Is it a good drug? Better than a sugar pill, and on par with other drugs from the same class? They compared it with 3 other drugs from the same class, okay? That were the standard of care before. Yeah. So, that was also my conclusion. And people were using this drug for many, many years because they thought that it's better than sugar, better than nothing, and comparable to another drugs. What they did not know is that there were actually many more studies done with the drug called reboxetine. So there were 7 studies comparing reboxetine to placebo, and there were 12 studies that were comparing reboxetine to another antidepressant drug. Out of 7 studies, 6 of them were negative. So they showed that this particular drug is no better than a sugar pill. They didn't get published. Only the one that showed that this is an effective drug got published. Out of the 12 studies that compared reboxetine with another antidepressant, 9 were negative, so they found that it's actually worse than different treatments. They didn't get published. 3 of them were positive, so as good as other drugs, and they got published. Is it a good drug? Exactly, it's not a good drug, and I felt cheated because I didn't have all the information at hand, right? Let's take a broader case, okay? Because that's only one drug in the antidepressant category. But there was a study actually done by Cochrane Library where they took all the trials in human subjects, all the clinical trials in human subjects of antidepressants in the US done over the period of 15 years. there were 38 trials that found out that those drugs are working well, and there were 36 trials that found out that those drugs are not effective, okay? Out of 38 trials with positive results, 37 of them were published. Out of 36 trials with negative results, 3 of them got published, okay? So this is how science is done, still up to this date. So even though you have, scientific evidence, you have peer-reviewed, multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, you cannot always, be totally trusting in them and, having absolute certainty that the choice that you're making is in fact the best one. Later, there was also another study done which found out that statistically positive findings are twice more likely to get published than negative findings, okay? So imagine I have a coin and I flip it 100 times and then I don't publish 50 results. You may think I have a coin with 2 heads, a double-headed coin, which is not the case, okay? And imagine if I did a study and I took 50% of my data points and I only did a study based on 50% of the data points, that would be essentially a research fraud. That would be bad science. That would be a bad study. Yet, for some reason, we allow, people to do 36 trials and publish only 3 of them, and we call it good study, okay? Because the responsibility disseminates among funding bodies, researchers, government agencies, sponsors, hospitals, and so on. It's really hard to point out who's responsible for this scientific publication bias. That's why nobody is held accountable, okay? And we have this kind of bad science. So this is what we call publication bias. It's a huge, 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 huge problem. Then we have data accessibility and reproducibility bias, okay? So if I run an experiment, I have a coin, okay? I toss it 100 times. I have, approximately 50 heads and 50 tails. I give the same coin to Oliver. He tosses it 100 times. He should have, similar results if we repeat it over and over again. Yet in science, especially in, science that's really important for us, for example, in preclinical oncology, okay? So cancer research, folks taking molecules and drugs and trying to find out what actually works to kill cancer cells. Only 11 to 20% of studies in basic biology can be replicated, okay? So about 80 to 90% of studies were done, but just once. And they can't be successfully replicated, which is, of course, another huge, huge problem. Last but not least, we have intellectual property issues. So, question. Replicated. Because most of the times the data upon which the study was done is not available. So it's very hard to, test the whole methodology, how they did it exactly, and so on. Most of the times only the results are published, okay? And of course, there's also a strong incentive to publish positive results. So it can happen that, in fact, it's a 50-50, but only the positive results get published, okay? So we don't have the full picture. That's going to be the second part of my talk. So if you bear with me, I'll just, briefly go through the intellectual property issues. So essentially, for those of you who know how intellectual property works, you invent something, you publish it, you patent it, you have something of value, which is called a patent, then you can sell it, and that's how commercial research companies make money. There are a couple of challenges, though. So, for example, if a group of independent thinkers inside a decentralized autonomous organization spread all over the world wanted to invent something, it's actually very hard to fractionize this intellectual property, distribute it among many people who contributed to this research, okay? And for that reason, people say that it also stifles research cooperation and makes cooperation, less probable to happen. So here comes DeSci, all dressed in white. And DeSci is actually based on many principles of open science. So research monetization, we should all be able to, participate in research and in discovery and be able to be rewarded. Diverse funding, not only from government agencies and pharma, but also, from people who actually care about research in specific area. Community involvement, open sourcing, so publishing of the data, publishing of the studies, also the negative ones upon which our research was done, an on-chain record of all these operations, so you can actually go and verify what was going on, how the research was done. So those are kind of the main assumptions of decentralized science. This builds on top of another movement, which is called open science, which is quite old, and kind of more traditional, but as you see, it actually propagates same principles. So reproducibility of results, scientific integrity, citizen science, which is similar to community involvement, promotion of collaborative work, ease of access to knowledge for all, and stimulation of innovation. So, because this is a pretty new space, folks started building in decentralized science only a couple years ago, I will actually be able to give you a good overview of what's going on in the space for the remaining 7 minutes if I hurry up. So if you look at scientific research, the way it's done, first you need funding, then you need to actually do some stuff, execute your research, and then at the other end of the funnel, you hope to publish the results, become a professor and live in glory for the rest of your life. So this is kind of, value chain of decentralized science or value chain of science as is. The first project, which I think is worth keeping an eye on, which is kind of an OG in the decentralized science space, is a project called Molecule. They have a platform technology for tokenization of IP, which is really well described in their Gitbook. I encourage you all to go and read through it. It's fascinating. So tokenization of intellectual property. So a DAO can actually do some research and then distribute the outcomes of those research in form of intellectual property tokens, which people can own, trade, exchange, and so on and so on. Out of that ecosystem, there's a bunch of so-called bio-DAOs, okay? And bio-DAOs are small community research organizations focused on specific subjects, right? So we have Synapse DAO focused on brain health, Vita DAO focused on longevity, Psy DAO focused on psychedelics, Athena DAO, women health, Valley DAO, I don't remember, Hair DAO, that's an easy one, so focused on hair, Cryo on cryopreservation, and Cerebrum DAO, you may guess, focused on brain health. So all of those DAOs raised millions of dollars, and they are funding research in specific areas of interest. There is a collaborative community of scientists who can get the research funded, start, doing the research, and ultimately share the commercial value of intellectual property that derives from that research. One of the prime examples is Vita DAO, focused on longevity, the oldest and the biggest one of the research DAOs. Then, if we go back to the DeSci value chain, there is the execution layer. There's a bunch of projects here. For example, Amino Chain, Genomes DAO, Data Lake, that's us. Here. I can't move, I can't zoom in, okay. Anyway, so for example, Genomes DAO is a DNA vault for your genomic data that promises first, making genomic data available to researchers, and second, monetizing that data on the side of the patients. We, as Data Lake, auto promotion here, so we are, a research company, essentially. We have our own blockchain tools for recruiting patients to scientific trials and managing of their informed consents, which is pretty simple technology. So we just keep track of all the consents and all the legal work connected with doing research on the blockchain transparently, and the patient stays in full control. We are doing commercial research as well. For example, we did an analysis of the breast cancer patients' pathways in Poland for one of the pharmaceutical companies. We are also doing the first community-funded registry for a rare disease called acid sphingomyelinase deficiency in Poland, also working with a bunch of scientists and industry companies. I think I don't have time to show you our tech unless we have a minute left. Anyway, the way we use blockchain is for storing an audit trail of all the consent operations. So if we go back to the principles of decentralized science, we are about on-chain record of scientific studies. And then finally, if your research is successful, then you perhaps want to publish the results. There are currently two platforms that are dealing with publishing of scientific results. The first one, and probably the biggest, is called Research Hub. It's co-founded by Brian Armstrong, whom you may know as the co-founder of Coinbase. And this is essentially a social network and a journal for scientists to publish their scientific research, to be rewarded with their coin, and kind of, distributing bounties, working together, doing peer reviews for each other, and creating this kind of, boiling plate of scientific research and cooperation. So think about it as a publishing paper and as a scientific social network with some incentive structure woven into it. Yeah, so that's, the example of research that they do. Last but not least, there's a fascinating project from the US and Switzerland called DeSci Labs. They are also a decentralized publishing network. So you can publish your results on the network, create research objects that live on the blockchain. You can publish your results, but also your data sets. So if somebody wants to replicate your study, they can go over there, read the whole logic, read the whole paper, download the data set, do your own analysis, and be able to draw your own conclusions from that study, right? So that would be all. I'm pretty much on time. There's 2 minutes left if there are any questions. There we go. We can hear you. All right. Right. And that's the whole question. So I think they didn't figure it out yet quite, because right now, the incentive is to publish in peer-reviewed journals and, increase your age index and, have citations and so on. And based on that, you climb the ladder of scientific ranks. Right now, I think they don't have it figured. Good question. I don't know. So they are peer-reviewed, I think. So they can put up, a reward in the research coin for peer reviews. I guess peers. But who they are, I'm not sure. But that's a good question. That's a good value. We haven't used this platform yet, because one of the research that I showed you on the previous slide, we actually got it done just last week. But, we are still considering whether it will be published on Research Hub. Perhaps yes. Yes. So in my basic understanding of the subject, which may be wrong, they have some form of, legal mechanism of linking an NFT token to the intellectual property from the research, and then fractionizing this NFT with a bunch of utility ERC20 tokens that are then distributed amongst the DAO members. So that's my simple understanding, but I may be wrong. Exactly. 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 That's all we have. Thank you.